To myself and most Americans, World War II is known as the Good War. The enemy was well-defined and the cause a worthy one. And out of the significant sacrifice, World War II lifted the nation out of the Great Depression, positioned the United States at the pinnacle of power, precipitated the rise of the middle class, and opened up unprecedented opportunities for minorities and women. And so even though Hollywood films include scenes of death, gore, and heartache, such stories from Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, and Brad Pitt also tell the story from a decidedly American lens, highlighting the greatest generation of heroic and courageous men who, when the task arose, stepped up to defend their country and to bring human rights, freedom, and democracy to those in need. And while America did play a big part in the effort to win World War II, this storytelling is a decidedly different narrative from what is taught in European classrooms and memorialized in stone and bronze. Because in truth, when I compare the education that I received on the Second World War compared to what's taught in classrooms right here in Germany and really throughout Europe, a very different and curious picture begins to emerge. So, let's take a look. Recently, a fellow YouTuber friend of ours, Philly from Germany, created a video that offered a fascinating portrait of how German school children are taught about the Second World War. And her video honestly really had me reflecting a lot about just how different our education is from one another on the same historical events. I was personally quite struck by how comprehensive German school children's education is on the subject, not simply covering events in objective textbook materials, but also supplementing the facts with subjective experience through literature and immersive learning opportunities with visits to concentration camps. And the impression that I received from Philly was that the education in Germany about World War II, again, isn't just simply about understanding the facts, but also equipping students with the ability to understand and recognize nationalism and fascism objectively, even being able to recognize when that same rhetoric is playing out in modern political landscapes as well. And that's something that's pretty critical because symbolism and rhetoric can be just as damaging. And that's why Nazi flags and the Nazi salute are also banned here in Germany. And again, that differs pretty significantly from how it's taught in the United States. For starters, World War II education is going to vary considerably from state to state, and even from school district to school district. There isn't necessarily a prescribed formula for how to present this information to students. But generally speaking, topics such as World War II and the Holocaust are generally going to be presented to students somewhere around middle school. And in general, World War II education in the US is taught no differently than other topics of history, from the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, or beyond. Because the thing is, history classes are not necessarily in depth or in great detail. Rather, history courses, for the most part, are presented and taught as a survey course. And since most school district textbooks are arranged chronologically, the section that I had on World War II is just really going to be limited to the big events and some key facts to support those events. So for example, you'll have a couple of pages about the key causes of problems in Europe, with a page or two about Asia, a couple of pages about Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and then the key events leading up to the surrender of Germany and Japan. Couple that with a discussion on the Holocaust, and it's a broad overview. All in all, it's an average of about 12 to 15 pages, mostly filled with photos, graphs, and charts. To be honest, it's focused really on the war, not necessarily what happened before or after, For example, we didn't really talk a whole lot about the political ideology of the Third Reich before World War II, or even the economic recovery and recession that happened in Europe after World War II ended. However, one discussion we did have on specific events, the things that I was taught that went into considerable detail, were centered around the American efforts in the war, particularly in the Pacific theater. And interestingly, I also recall the discussions that we had in the classroom surrounding the ethics of dropping the first nuclear bomb on civilians and whether or not that was actually justified. And to my teacher's credit, it was really the first time I can recall in my education about actually having a real discussion on ethics and right and wrong in an American public school setting. But again, World War II education and content is going to vary considerably depending on your school district. Like Feli's experience in Germany, there may be attempts by some teachers to add additional materials and assignments to expand the minds of students to the causes, events, and effects. So, for example, when I was learning about World War II in history class, my AP English teacher also coordinated to have us read the Diary of Anne Frank simultaneously. But again, that isn't something that's standard across the board. And honestly, I think a lot of the reason too about just the brevity of the conversation surrounding World War II isn't that they're trying to downplay it at all, but just simply that American school teachers have a lot to cover. They have an entire curriculum to present to students in a pretty short amount of time. So a lot of times it's just sort of like, here's the information, quiz, test, and move on to the next thing. And unfortunately, that lack of real in-depth context and prolonged conversation about this particular event in history also comes up when Americans are inevitably polled or quizzed on their general knowledge about World War II. For example, according to a Pew Research survey, fewer than half of Americans actually know that Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany through a democratic political process. Nearly 1 in 10 Americans believes that the US fought Russia in World War II. And even scarier is that a 2008 Common Core survey found that 20% of American 17-year-olds don't even know who our enemy even was in World War II. And those statistics, again, I would wager, have a heck of a lot to do with the fact that history courses are taught in a survey-style setting in American public school systems. Again, we just don't really spend a heck of a lot of time diving deep into the reasons for why wars become war and the ideologies behind the different political parties and the power struggles at play. And unfortunately, I do think it is kind of a shame that we also don't really have a very in-depth discussion about equipping students with the abilities to recognize when these same type of sentiments and the same style of rhetoric is even being said today. In short, we learn historical events in history class, not necessarily about how history can and will repeat itself in the context of contemporary government and modern civic duty. But something that Feli also mentioned in her video was that as a German citizen now living in the United States, one of the things that she has noticed is that Americans love to talk about World War II. And that's kind of curious, right? If Americans aren't taught any more about World War II than they are about the Civil War or the Revolutionary War, then why do we like to talk about it so much? Well, my not-so-hot take on American knowledge about the Second World War is that Brad Pitt and Tom Hanks have done far more to influence American knowledge of World War II than any American textbook.
Grazie.
Okay, but in all seriousness, all jokes aside, there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of World War II movies. And when you look towards Hollywood, we have somewhat romanticized World War II, particularly when the storyline has a happy ending. Whether it's Captain America punching Nazis, Indiana Jones stealing back the Holy Grail from the Nazi tomb raiders in Egypt, Or Wonder Woman aiding and falling in love with a World War II American fighter pilot. It's an immensely flattering and seductive narrative. Because unlike the nations of Europe and Asia, the United States suffered no invasions of its homeland, no area bombing of its cities, apart from the US-based attack of Pearl Harbor, of course, but again, that primarily affected a military installation. And of course, no mass killings of its civilians. So it's somewhat nostalgic to celebrate our victory in film and the boom that happened in post-war society, catapulting us to top dog amongst the global world powers. But moving to Europe provided me with a much deeper contextual relationship for how war affected everyday people and their environments. Here in Freiburg, our first apartment was in a building that was nearly leveled in the bombing that not only reduced our medieval city to rubble, but inflicted scars on the community that can still be felt today. You live physically with the memories of war in Europe in ways that is often difficult to understand in the United States. So reflecting on all of this in popular German cinema, German war films, especially in the last few decades, tend to deal with the subject with honesty, showing the gradual shift to madness caused by hollow mass delusions, often in a tone more fatalistic than heroic. Therefore, they can be much deeper than the typical war movie, and if you're up for it, you might enjoy works such as the Generation War miniseries, Unsere Mütter, unsere Vater.
Wir waren unsterblich. Wir sollten es bald besser wissen.
Or the movie The Fall, Der Untergang.
Und doch habe ich allein auf mich gestellt, ganz Europa erobert.
Or the recent Oscar winner, All Quiet on the Western Front, Im Westen nichts Neues, an epic war film based on the 1929 novel of the same name by Erich Maria Remarque.
Wir bleiben zusammen.
So whereas German film tends to be brutal but honest, American cinema about World War II tends to crystallize this really romanticized version of events in World War II and tends to kind of wipe away the ambivalence and difference of opinion that actually existed about World War II while it was going on in the United States. And that's really an important part of history that I find is often forgotten and not really underscored in American education about World War II. After Pearl Harbor, the cry was to avenge, not to liberate. And our entrance into the war itself, particularly to aid the conflict in the European theater, wasn't because we declared war on Germany. Germany declared war on us. So the idea that we as Americans went to war to specifically or even primarily liberate Europe is largely a work of fiction, even though it's undoubtable that we did a lot to accomplish that feat. But that storyline is really pervasive and quite popular in the United States. As Steven Spielberg's biographer Lester Friedman puts it, wartime settings generally provide numerous opportunities for ascertaining, distilling, reinforcing, and sustaining key American ideals of appropriate behavior, valiant action, and gratifying achievement. And these films remain ever popular because they show American servicemen and women demonstrating their moral authority and earn their ultimate victory by fighting bravely, honorably, and fairly. And so whether it's books, films, TV shows, or video games, such as the latest installment of the hugely successful Call of Duty franchise, which by the way now boasts 6 World War II games, takes place in the Western European theater. So it's true that Americans have a voracious appetite for war media. And for me personally, this popularity of American World War II storytelling and its just pervasiveness in film really does crystallize together in just how American-centric my education about World War II really was, and also it really makes me think a lot back about how we remember World War II in even the physical sense. Now, to be fair, ethnocentrism, or when people of a nation view events through the lens of their own history, it isn't unique to the United States. After all countries usually mandate courses on the history of their nation in their own educational systems. So learning about the history of other nations is probably a lot less likely. It's why when we open up conversations about World War II, it's not uncommon to find that Canadians will focus on Normandy and Juno Beach. Americans will talk a lot about the Pacific theater of the war. Brits will talk about the Battle of Britain, and Russians on the major battle against the Germans, like the Battle of Stalingrad. But I do think that Winston Churchill put it better than I ever could. History is written by the victors. And perhaps the greatest error of historical fact that I have actually heard from other Americans in their interpretation of the war is the idea that the United States won it pretty much single-handedly. In fact, while American production and money was no doubt indispensable to the overall success of the Allies, actual American fighting was mostly a sideshow to the major conflict, which was the fight between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. In fact, the Eastern European theater, which is rarely portrayed in popular American media, by comparison, over 30 million people were killed, including the vast majority of Holocaust victims. During the war, the Soviets suffered perhaps 9 million soldiers killed and 16 million civilian deaths, while the German forces lost about 4.4 million soldiers, or 80% of their total losses, as compared to less than 1 million killed in the Western Front. And in total, America suffered a bit over 400,000 casualties, a horrifying number to be sure, but the Soviets lost more than that in the Battle of Stalingrad alone. So while I don't like to align myself with Stalin on just about anything, there actually is a pretty adequate quote that's often attributed to him. To defeat Nazism, the British gave time, the Americans gave money, and the Soviet Union gave blood. Yet when we as Americans commemorate World War II, the way we remember the sacrifices made by our countrymen and women in the war efforts, it is actually quite striking in just how different it is to the war memorials that are prevalent here in Europe. I mean, check out the symbology of the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. Unlike the sobering Vietnam Memorial nearby and the tasteful and understated Korean War Memorial, this is unquestionably a celebration of conflict. It's supposed to be a monument to American triumph, shared among all 56 U.S. states and territories, each one of which gets its own granite pillar, with its ideological content, exact symmetry, multiple wreaths and eagles. It underscores victory despite the sacrifice. Whereas war memorials here in Europe tend to underscore sacrifice despite the victory, such as the monument to the women of World War II located in Whitehall, London, or the memorial to Fighting France located in Fort Mont-Valérien. Of course, in Germany, memorials to the fallen troops are understandably demure. In most villages in Germany, you'll find a small memorial to the local men and women who were killed in action. The larger, more expansive memorials to commemorate, remember, and educate on the Holocaust and persecution of the Jews, such as the Jewish Museum and the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, both located in Berlin, or the emotional and powerful Stolpersteine project, in English, the Stumbling Stones. The more than 45,000 shiny bronze plaques located in over 1,100 locations in 17 European countries, which individually commemorates a victim of the Holocaust at that person's last known address. It reinforces the impact of this period and the toll it took on everyday people, dramatically altering communities and entire generations of families. And all told, what memorials like this really underscore for me is that World War II should be remembered as one of the darkest times in world history. and not necessarily as a story of uncomplicated, grand heroism. And learning about World War II from different perspectives can, of course, broaden our understanding and empathy for people of different backgrounds and experiences. It reminds us that history is not just a set of facts, but a dynamic tapestry of interpretations and narratives. And now, of course, I would love to hear from you down in the comments section. How was World War II taught in your home country? What aspects of the war, the stories that are told, do you think are important to include, or do you actually think could be improved more upon? Please let me know down in the comment section below. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from the Black Forest family, hit that subscribe button. So I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!